Well, thank you all for being here. And it's a pleasure to introduce Ruth and the Turtle Point Press, a press I guess I've known about since 1999 when you published, when Richard Howard published a book called Trappings, which was quite wonderful, and it was very handsomely put together. Turtle Point Press was born in 1990 out of a house in Westchester, or Turtle Point Road, by a man who loves libraries and used bookstores and art and was tired of working in his family's chemical dye company. Jonathan Rabinowitz knew nothing about publishing, but his usual finds, always beautifully produced, got noticed. The mix of undiscovered and rediscovered gems, the diary of a gold rush miner, Joan of Arc in her own words, memoirs of the man who killed Rasputin, new works and translations by important voices like Richard Howard, Benjamin Taylor, collections of letters by James Schuyler and Frank O'Hara. It was a winning combination. Ruth Greenstein always reads the obituaries first. She started her publishing career at Harcourt in 1989 and has been a staff editor at Echo. She's a founding member of Words into Print, an independent editors alliance, and is the director of Green Line Publishing Consultants. In 1994, while she was an editor at Harcourt, Ruth read the Times obituary of curator and critic Henry Geldzahler. At the end of it was a mention of his book of essays and criticism from Turtle Point Press. Ruth phoned up the press to inquire about paperback rights, and she and Jonathan struck a deal and became colleagues. And when Ruth ventured out on her own, she edited many books for Turtle Point and its imprints. Turtle Point, the next generation, was born in May 2016 out of an apartment in Greenpoint by a woman who knew nothing about being a publisher. Ruth is most excited by work that introduces her to new places or subcultures or that uses language in unusual ways. She's delighted so far to have published books that have ranged from Munich and Mexico to Havana to Venezuela to big wave women surfing to the worlds you'll discover here. Half the writers reading tonight are here because of John Rabinowitz, whose continuing influence on the press is clear. It was John who courted Ted Delaney after spotting his stories in The Atlantic, then publishing his novel Broken Irish to great success. That book has now been optioned for a limited TV series. John has been David Trinidad's longtime publisher. They worked on 6 books together. And Ruth Greenstein might never have thought about the idea of a memoir by Grace Schulman if John hadn't bumped into Grace at a party and asked if she had ever thought of writing one. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ruth Greenstein.
Thanks so much. And thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here. So, Ted Delaney is our first reader. Ted is an award-winning author, journalist, and filmmaker. His books include the novels Follow the Sun, Broken Irish, and Warp and Weft, and also the story collection The Drowning. His short fiction has been published in The Atlantic and Best American Short Stories and featured on Public Radio's Selection Shorts program. He's received the PEN New England Award, an O. Henry Prize, and an NEA Fellowship. He's also the co-author of Born to Play by Boston Red Sox second baseman Dustin Pedroia. As a journalist, Ted has written for the Denver Post, the Chicago Tribune. He's received the National Education Reporting Award, and he served as an editor at the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard. As a filmmaker, he's directed and produced documentaries, including The Times Were Never So Bad, The Life of Andre Dubus, and The Library of the Early Mind. Ted lives in Rhode Island, where he teaches at Roger Williams University, and he edits the literary journal Mount Hope. His newest work, The Big Impossible, will be published in the fall. And Ted?
Thanks, Ruth. What a pleasure to be here at this literary landmark. Wonderful place. And spend some time on the way out taking the slow trip. So I'm just going to read you a few short bits from Follow the Sun and kind of set you up a little bit on the way. But the book starts a little bit after the fact with a funeral. So I'm going to read that. It's a very short piece, and then I'll kind of walk you through a couple of others. The funeral for a missing man becomes reduced to objects, small proxies, a collection of artifacts. In lieu of a body, just left behind things. Things judged dear to the departed or emblematic of his quicksilver existence, as all our existences are ultimately mercurial. The table where the eye looks for a casket is set up with the childhood photos and the chosen props, the mildewed leather baseball glove, the football cleats, all the equipment of lost youth. The brass sextant, ceremonial, and that day left behind, ironic perhaps, for a man disappeared into the sea. Some rust-tinged tools as if a place setting for a simple life. As present in the moment are the objects not offered. The needles and pipes and plastic bags, all those defeated soldiers of a decades-long war. How ironic, then, that his beloved sea has claimed him after he thought he'd looked behind all of his demons. The funeral parlor filled with his own kind of two kinds. The remnants of his family and old friends, and to the other side, the thick-handed lobstermen, rubbing their weathered faces, itching to cast off, even as they account for another loss among them. Small murmurs in the back rows about another, a man swept off a deck down by Cape May. They sit in leather jackets and mended trousers and look warily at those here who are not among their ranks. Their boats fill the harbor today. The lobsters are granted stay. A man is gone, but a table of effects remain as scant touchstones of a full existence. And over it hangs that fog of indistinct death, and possibly of murder, but by whom and to whom, still unknown. So the book opens with that, and it moves along, and it kind of goes backwards a little, but then it begins to focus a little bit on his mostly estranged daughter, Christine. So I go ahead to that, and let me find my right spot. She's just graduated from high school. She doesn't know him particularly well. Memories of her father were always as thin as the inked lines of his words. It seemed to be only the hardest of those ones that stayed with her. As she tried to pull back something to remember him by, she understood it had been she who had cut the tie and he who had allowed it too easily. This had been the time when Quinn was still taking her out one day a week. She was 6 or 7, the divorce still fresh. She, decked out in her best dress, with her toys and her backpack for moral support, waiting on the front steps for him to show. Gina sat in the kitchen in her stained bathrobe, hungover and smoking cigarettes, with a man whose name Tina didn't know, a man sitting shirtless and barefoot in his fish-smelling jeans. The truck came rattling up the way, the metal reverb of a loose muffler when he stopped. Quinn looked over at her with what felt like the same fear she had. He swung the passenger door open, its hinges groaning, and she stepped onto a floorboard covered in coffee cups and sandwich wrappers. He stomped on the gas pedal, and they were off. The first stop was her grandparents', where they all sat awkwardly while Tina was served toast. Her grandfather gruffly asked about her life, and she gave them a story with enough holes in them to see that she was protecting her mother. It felt natural at that age to do that. She talked about school, and they all smiled knowingly when she said she didn't like it. Family trait, no doubt. After a period of silence, her grandmother smiled and asked her what she wanted for Christmas. "It's only October," she said. After that, she and Quinn got back into his old pickup truck and took on a long stretch of hours where they could eat lunch. He more or less just drove around. "Can I see where you live?" she said. That probably wouldn't be a good idea right now. She didn't like being around his boat because of the sting. She didn't like going out on the water, and that pretty much dead-ended any of his ideas for activities. They drove up a narrow street above the harbor, and he said, "I have to run in here. I'll be right out." He went up the steps of an old house and in. Tina locked the truck's doors and turned the dial of the old AM radio until she found any music at all. She was relieved to be in the truck alone. but felt less so when he didn't come right back out. It seemed a while. She took out a picture book she had in her pack and tried to get interested in that. There was a tap on the side window. She looked up, and it was a face that startled her, red-faced, wild-bearded, a man with eyes that seemed to be rotating in their sockets. "Hey, do you know what time it is?" he said. She was frozen. "I need the time." She said, "It's about 11 o'clock. "What? 11, she said. "I can't hear you," he said, even though she could hear him. He tried the door handle. "Unlock the door so I can hear you," he said. She couldn't move or speak. He came around the front of the truck and to the driver's side. He tried the door, then again trying to force it. The lock held, and he walked around the truck again, trying to find entrance. Tina was openly crying now, but that didn't seem to back him off. She was in that glass capsule, and he was circling inward. He seemed angry now, but then he turned his head, the sound of a vehicle on the street down the block. "I just needed to know what time it was," he said, and as if an offended party, he stalked off. It was still a long time before her father keyed the door and slid onto the seat. She'd wiped her face with her sleeves until it was raw, and he could see. "What's the matter with you?" he said. "Nothing. I wasn't that long," he said. She burst into tears again. "Do you want to talk about something?" he said. "No." "Oh, Jesus Christ," he said. He was supposed to drop her back at 6, but when he did, after a seeming eternity, it was more like 4, to Gina's irritation. It was the last visitation he'd make. Her relief was palpable and forever guilt-inducing. It was the last time she saw him. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce the next writer, Catherine Coles. Catherine is the author of the hybrid biography memoir, Look Both Ways, a doable journey along my grandmother's far-flung path. She has also published 2 novels and 6 collections of poems, the 5th of which, The Earth Is Not Flat, was written under the auspices of the National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers Program. The recipient of grants from the NEA, the NEH, and the Guggenheim Foundation, she served as Poet Laureate of Utah and was inaugural director of the Poetry Foundation's Harriet Monroe Poetry Institute. She is a distinguished professor of English at the University of Utah and is currently working with Poets House on a program called Fieldwork, aligning poetry and science, which brings poetry into libraries and natural history museums. Her 7th book of poems, Wayward, will be published by Red Hen Press this spring. Please welcome Catherine Coles.
Thank you, Ted. I can't wait to read that book. I want to start also by thanking the Strand Bookstore for hosting us, for thanking Ruth Greenstein for believing in this book and being willing to do something about believing it, which it turns out those are 2 different things. Grace is nodding at me. She knows what I'm talking about. The Writers Studio and Phil, thank you so much for doing all the work to bring us here together. I was a student of Richard Howard's when he was making the transition from whatever his previous publisher was to Turtle Point. The other publisher didn't want to publish his explicitly sexual material. Grace is also nodding at this, and Turtle Point would do it, would pick it up. So this is the virtue of publishers who publish what they want to because they believe in it, and thank you for that. Thanks to all of you for coming out. This book is, that's my grandmother in 1923 on the cover. It's a book. It began as a book about my grandparents. My grandfather was an explorer. He became the chief geologist for Standard Oil eventually and was a rapacious resource capitalist and traveled all over the world being that. And my grandmother, who married him in 1926, was a wayward flapper of 20 at that time, and she traveled with him. And while he was out in the jungles macheting his way through the vines with leeches clinging to his body and poison arrows flying at them from the jungle. She was having affairs with diplomats and early Dutch pilots in the colonial cities. So usually I read something that has something to do with that, but that takes longer than I actually have tonight. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the other thread, the thing that this book became about, which was my search for my grandparents through many thousands of pages of documents, my grandfather's films, which he started taking in 1926, and also eventually, much to my husband's chagrin, because he's not a person who would go to Antarctica, for example, much to his chagrin, I started these forays starting in about 2002, right after the terrible events of September 11th, when the State Department was telling people, do not go to Indonesia under any circumstances, et cetera. I was traipsing off to these places, and our university president was reassuring my husband, don't worry, if she gets kidnapped, we'll get her out. But not from Colombia at the time. I had to wait to go there. This is set in Indonesia. I'm following my grandmother. She's in 1934. I'm in 2002. And if you see my finger go up, it means that the text has just lapsed into italics, and one of my grandparents has just written what I'm saying. But that's the only indication that you look at. Miriam is my grandmother's name. Miriam loaded suitcases, a box of books, the kids, and Koki into the car and headed over the mountains toward Selebintana, tooting slowed through foot and buffalo and bicycle traffic, moving it aside. Even now, the drive takes 4 tooth-breaking hours, 120 kilometers over roads jammed with tiny green buses, motorbikes, pedestrians, horse carts, bicycle rickshaws, all jostling for space on narrow, rutted pavement. Since passing Indonesian customs a week ago, I haven't seen another Westerner. The State Department warning covers not only North Americans, but also Europeans and Australians. Wherever I walk, people greet me, those with little English, hello, mister, with slightly more, hello, miss, those with more English, kindly, be careful. In my ambling female solitude, my lack of care is apparent. Those with more English ask where my husband is. Coming soon, I say, unused to being marked out, following my guidebook's tips for women traveling alone in this place where Chris would never come. Jalan, Jalan, I say, just walking. Everywhere, walking alone. I'm warned not to. In the colonial Dutch East Indies, she could drive into these mountains with 2 small children and a native nurse honking equally at people, dogs, buffalo, no questions asked. Pale, crew-cut, with Miriam's blue eyes, from the back seat of a van moving through pedestrian, animal, and wheeled traffic at walking pace, even without her jaunty hat, I turn heads. Then, as now, the Grand Hotel Selebintana sat at the bottom of Gunung Gede, its stone gates now abandoned. In 1934, tended by a keeper whose job it was to keep the natives off their sacred mountain. As dusk fell, Miriam entered another world, the rising mist silky on her skin. She was glad she'd brought extra blankets for the children. The half-caste desk clerk checked her in, and the boy carried her bags down a rain-slicked path to her bungalow, while monkeys hooted from the trees, narrating her passage. She arrived, as I do, just before dinner. Guests lined up at the desk to pick up letters and reserve horses or tennis courts. They chattered in Dutch at the bar. For me, a dark lobby, one bulb shining down a hall behind the unoccupied desk. No bell. When I was planning my travel, it took me days online to find the place still existed. But in spite of the darkness, everything looks clean and operational. I clear my voice, call, hello? Again, a little louder. A young woman appears. She seems surprised to see my name in her book and asks where my husband is, in English no better than my wholly inadequate Indonesian. As I watch the bellboy carry my duffel across the dark grounds, I realize nobody else is here. I've eaten nothing since breakfast, before I got on the plane in Sumatra, but the hotel restaurant remains dark, chairs upended on the tables. Why am I their only guest? I will never know, having no words to ask, as she has no words to tell me. My driver, Amal, asks her a question. The two speak rapidly in Indonesian. He gestures me back to the van and drives me down into the crowded town, its smoke and noise, and pulls over at a grocery store. Flocks of women in headscarves move along the aisles, picking over produce, some familiar, some alien. No, the fare is ordinary. I am alien. Exhausted, hungry, I wander under the lights. Heads turn. I find foods I can eat without cooking. Oranges, mangoes, and bananas, safe because of their peels, and avocado, trail mix with nuts. Bottled water. No wine, of course. At home, I eat the darkest bitter chocolate, but here I buy Toblerone because I know what it is. Dutch licorice more to my taste, black and salty. My grandmother has bathed, donned an evening dress, and walked to the restaurant, its lights blazing and glassware gleaming. Her shawl, peach silk, embroidered with scarlet roses. She will send me one Christmas when I'm in college. I still wear it. Amal was kind to see my need. He drops me off and drives away. Does he have a bed here, or will he sleep in the van? I don't know how to ask. Now, online photos show updated rooms, but that night my bungalow is as it must have been for her, down to Art Deco furniture and the shock of a cold water bath. The quiet, punctuated by the cries of monkeys and birds settling for the night, has a physical presence, as does the volcano looming in the dark. I eat under a bare bulb on the terrace, spotlit. After testing the locks on the doors and windows and checking my phone to find I have no coverage and can't call home, I shiver through my bath and go to bed. My mind will not stop moving from floating market to volcano to supermarket. Everything's strange. A jungled night, a poor night for sleep. Music pulses, grows louder. I have been hearing it for some time just beneath my awareness. People singing, calling. I put on my robe and step onto my terrace. Light flickers up the mountain, a ritual. The rhythm and tone of the music intensifies, haunting. Fire pulses through the dense trees. I could dress and go up. Nancy Drew would in any of the books Miriam sent me every Christmas till I turned 12. And her, whatever this is, it wouldn't have happened in 1934 with a hotel full of Dutch. I am completely alone. In Salt Lake City, Chris has a copy of my itinerary, but I can't call him for my own peace of mind any more than for his. This is what I love about travel, the illusion of being adrift on the earth, untethered, unlocatable. No one who knows me knows where on earth I am. But here I am not protected by a bubble of whiteness and a colonial legal code. I am suspect by nationality, vulnerable by gender in a way I usually decline to think about. Alone, a little afraid, trying impossibly to go unnoticed. My grandfather stepped into the coolies' camp, and unleashed his meager Malay. I will not venture alone at midnight onto this sacred mountain, with its God who would hardly welcome me hovering, even having come from so far away, looking for something I can't explain. Chris would call me sensible for once. I am a coward. The music throbs for hours. Footsteps pass between my window, and every time I hold still, wondering if those people know I am here, a woman without my husband, and that I cannot even understand my driver. I lie awake, waiting for a step to pause, for a hand on my doorknob. I get up twice to check the locks. Only later will I wonder why I thought anyone might consider me at all, plunged as they were into dance, music, their lives. Just before dawn, I doze. I get up groggy, dress, walk up the grounds toward the mountain. The path, though well-traveled, is abandoned. I smell ashes. The jungle is so thick the site could be anywhere just a few feet off the trail, and I might never find it. The air blows fresh, and the birds, waking, have begun to sing, to stretch their wings on the breeze. Thank you very much. Joseph Keckler is a singer, musician, writer, artist, and humorist. He performs widely and has appeared at venues such as Lincoln Center, Brooklyn Academy of Music, XSW, Miami Art Basel, and Centre Pompidou. He is the author of several plays and many songs, and has written about contemporary art for Vice and other publications. His work has been featured on WNYC and BBC America, and he has received a number of awards, including a Creative Capital Grant and a fellowship from New York Foundation for the Arts. The New York Times writes that Keckler has the sensibility of a magician, a trickster's dark humor, and a formidable musical and literary erudition. And Olivia Lane calls him a vagabond of the outer boroughs, with an eye for the unorthodox, irregular, anomalous, and uncanny. Dragon at the Edge of a Flat World is his first book.
Hello. I didn't decide what to read yet. I had two things. I think that I'm going to read something. I could either read something new that's, old that's in the book, or super new that's not. I think I'm going to read the new thing. Is that okay, Ruth? Okay. But it's, everything in the book is like a character sketch, humorous, and this is a rant. So, but I'm just going to give it a whirl. And some things I say in this I think are true. And yet, other things, I think I had to say them to make space for other things to be true. So now, we'll see how it all shakes down. I was in an optimistic mood, encouraging a writer friend to go for larger opportunities. I turned to her impressed. But don't you want your work to be more out there, more present in the culture? She thought for a moment and then asked, "What culture?" Good question. We were sitting on her roof in Bushwick, a neighborhood where the price of some bedrooms has tripled within a few short years. When I first came to New York, the previous it zone of Williamsburg felt eerily like a college town with no college, teeming with much maligned hipsters, reputedly great admirers of art, yet questionable practitioners of it. More extreme, though, is today's Bushwick. It feels like a college party with neither college nor town. And art has floated out of the picture. Every night is Friday night, a blur by morning. Drunks in sandals amble through the streets, lined with posh, discarded furniture, presumably the result of endless move-outs or upgrades. The rich white kids coming here are the living dead, roaming a cemetery of expensive trash. And they make hipsters look like true aesthetes. Gentrification has psychologically aged me. A decade and change into New York life, here I sit grumpily, like a cat that doesn't want you to pet it, complaining about the new people moving to the city and shouldering so heavy a resentment against the chain restaurant that replaced my local diner that I am driven to treat it like Medusa, never looking at it straight on. The landscape here changes so rapidly, I struggle to recognize myself inside of it. I'm aware that as a white transplant to the neighborhood, I am both a witness to as well as an unwitting, unwanting participant in a colonial cycle of displacement about which generations of Black, Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Chinese people have far greater reason to complain. I also did not experience the dramatic changes to the city, including the ravages of AIDS, that my older friends in the art world did. But I find myself prematurely becoming like the baby boomer artists I know who are holding out in the East Village, a faction of whom seem to view themselves as the designated mourners of New York's cultural death, their gazes fixed on the disappearance of that particular neighborhood. New York City has too long been caught in a feedback loop with its own televised image. Before gaggles of pajama-clad Caucasians were traipsing around the sidewalks of Bushwick while speaking loudly about exfoliating, there was a string of sitcoms that advertised a lazy day's existence of breezing in and out of newly renovated flats to fixate on picayune dilemmas. Now, I am climbing up a mountain with a bullhorn to announce the obvious, but here it goes. Just as many Americans could picture our president as a man in charge because he'd already played a boss on TV, so for decades New York has distorted into a reimagined, de-imagined version of itself that the public became familiar with through their screens. Art should come from life, but right now in the United States, too much of life comes from entertainment. Even the Brooklyn drag scene, one of the city's liveliest phenomena to spring up in recent memory, was ignited by a television show rather than the other way around. Is New York still the beating heart of American culture, or merely the locus of a cadaveric spasm at the end of an empire? You tell me. Don't get me wrong, I'm recklessly committed to living in the city and participating in new moments, and I'm certainly not wishing that it were as it was when I arrived. New York's official glory days were long gone by then, too. The late aughts were about a vague electroclash hangover, the anti-folk scene, often crafty but also too cute, indie outfits who largely acted out rock star fantasies, offering up depressive anthems, pulsating with forced pathos, as well as auto-soporific lullabies redolent of a lost childhood where the video games were simpler, experimental theater plays that often felt like wheel-spinning college skits taken too far, and all the while nightlife was dominated by the freshly refurbished expressions of cabaret and burlesque. I participated in many of these scenes when I started out, delivering an array of half-baked performances, my contribution to the unglorious decline of civilization. Yet there were also shining masters who transcended the given medium in every one of these scenes. Still, no movement felt like a vital counterculture to the mainstream, more like sideshows of nostalgia. As the nation watched televised talent competitions featuring contestants who hoped to be raptured up into the realm of celebrity after singing to karaoke tracks of songs from bygone and livelier eras, we were singing those same songs on stage in New York clubs. The only difference was we were singing them lugubriously, with a piano and some fleeting sense of irony. New York, of course, is not the, and I'm reading this fast just so I can do it in 10 minutes. Maybe I'll read it faster. New York, of course, is not the end-all. There are interesting scenes in Miami, Detroit, Baltimore, Austin. There are many other cities I haven't seen, temples of grit, districts of new pleasures to which I've yet to be admitted. Whatever is going on, though, will most of us ever know? And how can we shine a light on a culture that's already there but is simply invisible? How long has everything been so corporate? A 22-year-old friend asked me the other day in regards to mainstream music and TV. Well, basically as long as I've been around, I'm sorry to say, but it's a relief that you noticed. In the course of several rich diatribes on the homogenization In the performing arts, a 62-year-old friend asserted that those individuals currently typed as character actors would have been leading ladies and men in the heyday of Hollywood. Supposing this is accurate, one wonders what would become of character actors of that time period were they transported into the present. Perhaps their strong facial features and distinctive manners would read as pitiably monstrous enough to inspire people to toss them coins on the train. In a recent New York Times profile on him, the legendary music producer Hal Wilner similarly lamented that the nation once lifted the weird into the mainstream but was now left without heroes or a genuine interest in culture. And even within my lifetime, I have watched blander and blander performers being trotted out and announced as new messiahs. Soon enough, we may prefer watching actual robots sing, dance, and act. A Roomba has more duende. A star should seem like an alien who came crashing down, a being that bubbles with particularity and moves, thinks, and behaves in accordance with her own mysterious set of principles, runs on her own strange motor. But I think of many recent pop stars the same way I think of the Freedom Tower. Yes, you are there, up in the sky, undeniable yet generic, more obstructive than alluring, erected in the wake of a violent loss. I accept you as part of the scenery, but I will not be visiting you. To refer to many of the famous figures of today as stars is misleading. It would be more apropos to describe them as black holes, devouring of attention, offering no illumination. I remember a bubblegum pop singer performing on a late-night TV show last year, sharing the stage with a bevy of dancing drag queens and voguers. Stunningly, she was upstaged by every single one, a silent chorus of authenticity prancing fiercely along the sidelines. Meanwhile, she strutted stiffly in cropped blonde hair like a babysitter on a tangent. When might we know their names and not hers? Novelist, playwright, and cultural critic Sarah Schulman, who along with the performance artist Penny Arcade has created an entire body of work chronicling cultural loss, recently observed that in American culture there is a constant false messaging that repetition of what is already known is good and familiarity equals quality. She went on to point out that the opposite is true. The most culturally valuable work is the invitation to question ourselves, how we think, and to vigorously question how we live. She couldn't be more right, and yet this is hardly a new problem. A century and a half ago, Oscar Wilde wrote, "The public has always been badly brought up. They are continually asking art to be popular, to please their want of taste, to flatter their absurd vanity, to tell them what they have been told before, to show them what they ought to be tired of seeing." Artists themselves at once desire and distrust popularity, as their task is to create something new on some level, and therefore somehow unfamiliar. We exist to disturb the peace, as James Baldwin put it. If my work is being widely embraced, it must be bad, thinks the artist, after spending her entire life trying to invent a language and praying to be understood. Another proposition: popularity could actually transform good art into bad. Even the most beautiful melody sounds vulgar once the public starts humming it, mused Des Esseintes in Against Nature. In the current climate, though, one needn't go out of one's way to avoid being popular. Trembling in the face of fame is a remote concern for most creatives. In fact, all the best minds of my generation I've checked in with this week are apparently consumed with the demands of survival, making statements such as, "Help, I'm locked in a psych ward at Bellevue Hospital," and "I'm sleeping in my studio space this month. Do you think the night janitor will tattle and get me kicked out? I hope no one finds out I'm homeless." Actually, the first person is dead now, so that's quite sad. Many of the greatest luminaries I've encountered are still toiling in the shadows, but those who have become celebrities have it bad too. I have been perched on balconies in Hollywood, in condos about to be sold, listening to aging household name actresses tell me they can no longer even get an audition. I've seen visual artists break down after being ignored and dismissed, dropped by their galleries after a rhapsodic 15. Putting people on pedestals and knocking them off, an unconscious pastime in America, precisely reflects the pattern that pop psychology articles warn us to watch out for, the telltale tactic of a clinical narcissist. Speaking of which, the ultimate celebrity, the ultimate American of the moment, famous for being rich, richer for being famous, happens to be the president. This state of affairs is certainly the result of a sick culture. We knew he was an attention monster, but we thought that he lacked the vision and focus of an actual dictator. Then he said he'd like us to treat him more like the North Koreans treat their fearsome leader. Our task as citizens is, of course, to stop him. Our task as artists, should we wish to be practical, might be to create a culture that would never again dream of electing a raging xenophobe who absent-mindedly lapses into infomercials advertising his line of steaks during political rallies and speaks predominantly in non-sentences. Beyond that, we choose the course. Some of us will observe and depict what is going on in a direct manner. Others will offer comic relief. Some of us will grope around in the dark in attempts to envision new ways of being. Now is as much a time for radical sensibilities and wild aesthetic maneuvers as for bold political strategies. Here's a few more bold claims, just to end it out. Culture will or obvious ones. Culture will not be saved by our universities. The academy is still an intellectual haven to some degree, but also a ghetto of the hypothetical. A theater of careful gestures where discourse precedes art rather than the reverse. The arts will not be saved by the internet, though the web once promised to reinvigorate the culture by revealing hidden artists and audiences to one another. It has largely failed. Its design required the labor of evolved minds, but it turns out the internet appeals to a primitive part of us. It has largely just turned us into mobs without streets and transfixed us with GIFs, the visual equivalent of a skipping record. Isn't it time to go outside? Finally, to continue looking to corporate entertainment for the redemption of American culture is to stuff quarters in a claw machine. What is in there will never be ours, and that's the only reason we ever wanted it. It is time to give away what we don't need and what is weighing us down. An Academy Award, by the way, is made of Britannium, which melts at a mere 255 degrees. It is warm in Bushwick tonight. Rats are running through the streets, ransacking our garbage, poised to inherit the earth. And I am not throwing stones from a glass house. I am just taking a breather on a wet sofa on the sidewalk, launching paper airplanes to pass the time. Thank you. This is in order, right? Oh, cool. Okay. So now I have the great privilege to introduce David Trinidad, who is known for the masterful use of popular culture in his poems. The poet James Schuyler wrote, "Trinidad turns the paste jewels of pop art into the real thing." His work is also associated with the innovative formalism of the New York school. Winner of a Lambda Literary Award and a finalist for the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize, Trinidad lives in Chicago, where he is a professor in the creative writing department at Columbia College. Swinging on a Star is his 5th poetry collection with Turtle Point Press, and he has also published 2 collaborative works with the press. He has 2 new works coming out this year: Punk Rock is Cool for the End of the World, a collection of writing by the late Los Angeles punk poet Ed Smith, and Divining Poets, Dickinson, a divination deck of quotes from Emily Dickinson, which is part of a new series Turtle Point will be launching in the fall, for which David is the series editor. So please give a round of applause to David Trinidad.
I'm very grateful for my nearly 20-year relationship with Turtle Point Press, first with Jonathan and now with Ruth. I'm going to read a few short poems from my last book, Swinging on a Star, and then a few new pieces. I wrote this after rewatching the movie Sunset Boulevard. The afterlife of fame is dark, a neglected mansion with vanishing court, rats in the empty pool, and antiquated actress languishing as ghost of her famous self flickers in the projector's beam, or framed in silver haunts every room. Face unrecognizable, name forgotten. Oh, float me to oblivion in my swan bed, with my bandaged wrists and doors shorn of locks, with swirl of my cigarette smoke and glitter of my jewels, and silent flutter of my weightless tool. Sylvia Plath was in a pink tulip with her lover. Were they bees? Anne Sexton in white silk, wrapped in folded over tissue like a 1940s/1950s doll in a box, an angel or bride doll. Thank you, Anne, for visiting my dream. Doorbell rang in dream. I half woke. Was it real? No, it was a dream doorbell. Ornament. An apple, a pear, with holes in it, hovering in each hole, a wasp. In the 1960s, when I was a teenager, I was obsessed with this line of lipstick that Yardley of London put out for teenage girls called the Poetry Collection. And they had shades like Couplet Coral, Sonnet Peach, Poetic Pink. So this is Mauve Ode. Love was more romantic in the 1960s. A boy could grow his hair long and wear striped pants and a purple velvet jacket with ruffled cuffs and not fear ridicule, while a girl, not quite as pretty as the boy, could twist lace and pale blue ribbons in her curls and pick wildflowers and pour out her heart in an ode no longer than a lipstick tube. This poem is based on the end credits of the Flintstones. Bedrock at night. Safe in their round granite houses from Stegosaurus and Snaggletooth, the cave people sleep. The caveman dreams of bowling strikes with a big stone ball. The cave woman beside him dreams of a new bone for her hair. Outside their round bedroom window, palm trees and animal tools are still. Dinosaur mower and scissor-beaked hedge clippers snooze together on the lawn. Even the bird car horn on the footmobile in the garage snores 3 cartoon Z's. The little suburb of Bedrock, deep in its Stone Age sleep, while above, stars big as boulders sparkle, and the full moon, biggest and roundest rock of all, presides over the blue prehistoric night. For the last year and a half or so, I've been writing these short prose pieces, which I guess, I don't know what to call them. I guess people are calling them prose poems. They look like prose poems, so I guess that's what they are. So I'll read a couple of those. My Peacoat. Lorene, a friend from high school drama class, called and said she'd read that Western Costume, the company that supplied costumes to the movie studios, was selling off a large part of their inventory. Did I want to go? My mother gave me permission and $10. What kind of costume could I buy with only $10? That Saturday morning, we drove to Hollywood, 1970, the air still relatively crisp, the sky still relatively blue. Lorene let me smoke in her car. Driving anywhere outside of the valley was an adventure, a glimpse of the still relatively scary real world. We parked on Melrose Avenue down the street from Paramount Pictures and walked to the monolithic costume warehouse. Once inside, we encountered row after row of floor-to-ceiling clothing. Lorene found several items, including a theatrical fur-trimmed stole that she ever after referred to as her countess wrap. I don't know what drew me to the peacoat. I pulled it from a rack of densely packed jackets. A heavy wool, double-breasted, navy blue coat with anchors on its 6 plastic buttons. It fit just right and cost $10. I loved my peacoat, wore it everywhere. I can see myself trudging to high school on a chilly morning, light fog drifting over clipped suburban hedges, furtively lighting a cigarette, then slipping my pack of Marlboro 100s back into one of its slit pockets. In time, the inside lining split. My peacoat began to fall apart. Undoubtedly, it ended up in a bag destined for the Goodwill. Decades later, I have to ask, how many extras are wearing my peacoat in old war movies? Aren't all of our clothes costumes? Was I a sailor in a past life? In this piece, uncharacteristically, I use initials instead of real names. Confession. It's something I'm not supposed to say, so I'll say it. I have some of Sylvia Plath's hair. In 2009, when I was doing research in the Plath archive at the Lilly Library at Indiana University, I met Kay, a local scholar. We became friendly. Kay had been doing Plath research for many years. An abundance of Plath hair is cataloged in the archive. Locks of baby hair, teenage ponytails, tresses, amber braids. Plath's mother saved everything. One night at dinner, I confessed to Kay that I'd been tempted to steal a few strands of Plath's baby hair, but decided against it. Just the thought made my hands shake. Kay freely admitted that in the days before the library had security cameras, she stole some of it. I'll give you some. Really? I have to find it first. It's in the house somewhere. After I returned home, I emailed Kay and reminded her of her offer. She wrote that she'd let me know when she located it. Months went by. I reminded again. Still haven't found it, she replied. I began to doubt that she would come through, but eventually she did and sent me in an envelope on which she'd written baby hair, much more than I expected, a small golden brown mass. Kay also sent some to P, a fellow Plathaholic. When I confessed to P, he divulged that he too was a recipient of Kay's contraband. I told Jay, a poet friend and Plath fan, about my secret stash. With tweezers, I carefully extracted a couple of strands from the mass, and the next time I saw Jay, presented them to her. Jay later told me she inserted them, with tweezers no doubt, into an empty pill capsule, think the bell jar, which she placed in her red Sylvia Plath matchbox alongside a tiny white plastic horse, think Ariel, and silver charms of a typewriter and half moon. Jay had pasted the matchbox with pictures of a bee, Plath, a woman's hand listlessly holding a glued-on miniature red silk rose, and a quote from one of Plath's poems, "The Coffin of a Midget." For a while, I misplaced the baby hair. It was in the house somewhere, but for the life of me, I couldn't find it. At last, I came across it. I put it in a box of photographs for safekeeping. When I first received the baby hair from Kay, I bought on Amazon a small red wooden box to put it in, made in Poland, decorated with hearts and flowers. Plathian, I have painted little hearts on everything, but it remains in Kay's envelope. I've yet to give the hair a proper home. And I'll end with a first experience. Elizabeth Bishop has first death in Nova Scotia, so this is first death in Sierra Madre. Only I accompanied my mother. I don't know why the rest of the family didn't come. July 1961, I was 8. We attended the viewing at night in a small chapel. With my mother's aunts, uncles, and cousins, we sat on the creaky wooden pews and prayed, while great-grandmother lay in an open casket, brightly lit and immaculately groomed, in a black dress, behind a partition of glass. But where were her spectacles? She who would give me pennies from a little dish on her vanity when we visited her in her house on West Montecito Street. I was asked if I wanted to kiss her. That much I remember. If I did, I've blocked it from my mind. The Mass the next morning is also a blank. But I do remember the foliage around Uncle Emile and Aunt Madeline's house, ferns with long, thin fronds, leaves with veins like bleeding red ink, heart-shaped elephant ears. The house, half hidden by plants, was white, terracotta tiles on the roof. Built into the bottom of a wall near the front steps, a tiny grilled door. This is where the milkman would put fresh bottles of milk. There was an identical door on the inside of the house, so the bottles could be removed without having to go outdoors. I thought this magical. In Uncle Emile's den, on a high white shelf, rows of colorfully painted cast iron toy soldiers. Is this the origin of my love of miniatures? Skin and hair completely white, Aunt Madeline told me not to touch anything. Her living room full of knickknacks, cut glass, china teacups. And on a table in the center of the room, under a glass dome, a winter scene. More cast iron figurines, ice skaters on a mirror pond, horse pulling a sleigh, bobsledders gliding down a hill of glittered cotton. The whole family went out to supper, a long table in a dimly lit restaurant. My mother's cousin Richard, who would come out late in life, ordered me a Shirley Temple, a fizzy pink drink with a maraschino cherry named after a movie star. That night, on the drive back to Chatsworth, my mother had me lie down in the back seat of our green Ford Falcon to sleep. But on the freeway, she kept calling my name, trying to get me to wake. She was afraid a car was following her, wanted me to sit up. When I did, it immediately veered away. Thank you. Grace Schulman is an acclaimed poet, most recently recipient of the Frost Medal for Distinguished Lifetime Achievement in American Poetry, the highest award of the Poetry Society of America. Among her other honors are the Aiken Taylor Award for Poetry, the Delmore Schwartz Memorial Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, New York University's Distinguished Alumni Award, a fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts, and 4 Pushcart Prizes. Schulman's memoir is Strange Paradise, Portrait of a Marriage. She is the author of 7 collections of poems, including Without a Claim, her most recent, and Days of Wonder, New and Selected Poems, a Library Journal Best Books of the Year. Her prose essays are collected in First Loves and Other Adventures, and she is the editor of the Poems of Marianne Moore, which I am grateful for. Schulman is former director of the Poetry Center of the 92nd Street Y and former poetry editor of The Nation magazine. She is Distinguished Professor of English at Baruch College, CUNY. She is completing her 8th collection of poems, The Sand Dollars. Please welcome Grace Schulman.
Thank you, David, and thank you for this program, Philip Schultz and Andrea Marcusa and Ruth Greenstein and Jonathan Rabinowitz for publishing this fine writing, which I've heard tonight. It's a privilege to be here tonight, and I'd like to read from my memoir, A Strange Paradise, Portrait of a Marriage, and also from a poem or two of the new poems I'm writing that are on the same subject, but written in very different ways. For me, writing poetry is very close to the imagination. It doesn't have to have happened the way it's written. But in writing prose, I felt I had a contract with the reader to tell what happened. Although I felt free to shape the narrator so that what happened could be what happened as the narrator saw it. But rather than go on with this, I will just read the work, and you'll perhaps see for yourself the differences. The memoir begins in the present, but goes into a flashback of my meeting with the man who became my husband, Jerome Shulman. Ironically, it was his long, fast stride that I remembered from when we first met in Washington Square Park. I hadn't expected to go there that Sunday, wanting instead to stay in and get to know the studio apartment I had just rented for $80 a month plus electric in a gangly 22-story brick building on University Place in Greenwich Village. I left my new home only when one of the maintenance workers who'd helped me move chairs in said I needed air. Noticing my guitar balanced precariously on top of a stack of china cups, he directed me to the park diagonally across the street from my building, where he said, slowly and with emphasis, "You can play in the fountain." I was astonished. What he called the fountain was a limestone circle in the center of the park, which, when dry, was brimming with another kind of energy. Faces, crowds of animated faces, people like me in their mid-20s were singing out Wimoweh and Suliram and Down by the Riverside with its refrain, "Study war no more," as though their fervor alone could achieve peace on earth. 1957 was a year of innocent hope, and these believers rallied, unaware that their dreams would be dashed in the following decade. In that stone ambience, on a cool September late afternoon, I sat strumming the guitar my father had bought for me while I was a student at Bard College 5 years before. Raised on West 86th Street in Manhattan, I was singing a rural Scotch-Irish ballad whose origin was far from mine. It began, "She was a lass from the low country." I was trying not to look at the man with cropped auburn hair who was sitting on the fountain rim next to me and did not sing. He seemed a few years older than the musicians around him, but he had a boy's gaze and a youthful way of waving his long arms. I was drawn to his hazel eyes, alert, then darting, which shone when his smile made creases at their corners. Because he did not meet my eyes, I thought he was listening to others, not to me. I was wrong. We didn't speak. Then Gahalea, Ruslan, and Greensleeves went by, our glances still wandering around or beyond each other. I had been informed that it was illegal to sing after 6 o'clock and invited some 20 folk singers to sing to my apartment across the square. A guitarist who enunciated Romanian lullabies thought that the man with cropped hair and hazel eyes, with a pretty young woman nearby, and with my permission asked the man to join us. The man wasn't with anyone. Back at my place, Michael Rowe, a spiritual, started up, to the dismay of neighbors objecting to noise. Still, the man was silent. I didn't know at that time that his behavior was characteristic. He would say years later, "Silence is the supreme contribution to conversation." That night, he left early, having surreptitiously copied the number on my telephone. He dialed it within an hour, announced his name, Jerry Schulman, and said in a low, unassuming voice that friends had left him theater tickets to West Side Story the next evening, and would I join him? When I accepted, he asked me to be ready at 6 and said we'd travel uptown together. The lie was transparent, though charming. The next night was a Monday, with its interval between performances, and his offer was a ruse to see me. It worked. Jerry appeared at the prearranged time and apologized for the change in plan. "The theater is closed tonight, and I don't have friends who leave me tickets. I just wanted to see you." Disarming. I played the show score on a record player. The song we liked best was "One Hand, One Heart," a marriage vow based on a traditional Spanish hymn to God. As the last notes faded, we looked at each other directly, unsmiling. He tells me that he's a physician doing research in influenza virus, noting his modest expertise. I assumed he was good at his profession. Then his presence was sparkling, and yet we hardly knew each other. He was open to the arts, especially, I thought, for a physician, but his receptiveness could be simply the momentary appeal of a woman playing the guitar, withdrawn the next day. What if his mind were closed, his views unacceptable? What if we were hopelessly at odds? I was to express these doubts to him on a subsequent meeting, when he would reply, "Inconceivable," and go on stroking my shoulder. From early on, he had a way of thinking me better than I was, less difficult, less mercurial. I wanted to become the woman he had in mind. On that first night, we ordered a moussaka delivery from a nearby restaurant and placed the plastic boxes on a table made from a door I'd sanded down and varnished. Unfortunately, the brass legs, badly attached, buckled under. With apologies, I brought a tray to my huge bed, and we settled there. Yes, we made love in the apartment building we were to live in, that he was to die in. Just a short passage that leads into one of the poems I wanted to read. And that passage has to do with the contradictions I found in our marriage. In my experience, the phrase happy marriage is a term of opposites, like friendly fire or famous poet. My marriage has been a feast of contradiction, radiance and dissatisfaction, intense loyalties, and devastating treacheries, freedom and the sacrifice, albeit willing, of independence, excitement and a kind of pleasant boredom. Now here's a new poem I wrote, really on the same subject. It's called Happiness. Happiness is not a campfire, but an occulting light, a field of fireflies that blink on, off, on. The tree you planted, whose apples fall to the ground, half rotten, half sweet. The streets jackhammers that fall quiet at night. The black skimmer's white underside. The life together, apart together. The long marriage, oxymoronic in its dank joy. Under a half moon, quivering through sycamores, you held my body half the night as I lay in your arms, sometimes half awake, speculating, well, happy families are unalike. I choose you with your handicap, your half mobility, not to mention your leisure in forsaking all others for the chance of our wholeness. I take you, my choice as certain as plankton on sand, lights up and arcs to the stars. Thank you.